I did it first as an architectural thing at Georgia Tech. So at Georgia Tech, I actually used the shadow casting idea to actually create architecture. But I've been doing this since 1975 when I had a studio in Atlanta with about a bunch of artists. Mostly concerned about the question, if an object can cast a shadow, can a shadow cast an object? And that's always been my kind of childlike phrase that I keep reiterating. So this piece, in a way, demonstrates a little bit of the idea of the concept of shadow casting, because it's basically a sundial. And what I did when I was at McDowell is I made 3 plaster casts just by folding tin foil and spraying it with Pam and pouring plaster and then taking that off. And then I made this piece because one of the aspects about a shadow is it comes from the object, but it belongs to the surface. So the surface has its own texture and form. But then the shadow, I trace the shadow on here, and then with a Dremel, I cut it in. So you're actually seeing the shadow now colluding with the form. And so it kind of demonstrates this idea that the shadow comes from the object, but it belongs to the surface. And then what I do in this whole rest of the show is basically sever the contract, if you might say the optical contract, between the object and the shadow, and I let the shadow go on. So when I talk about the primitives, the thing about the primitives, these are the original shadow casts. And when I'm doing shadow casting, I go out at least 3 times of the day, morning, afternoon, and evening. And I have a box of toys. It's a bunch of leftover blocks from studios, leftover pieces of wood, half of a model. I just jam it all into a bag. And then when I get ready, I pull pieces out and I set them up. But the first thing I have to do is set up an east-west axis on the paper so that the paper is always oriented east-west so that the sun in the south is moving. And when I'm casting, the shadows are being projected as I move. And so like in this one, I actually put things in the 4 corners. And sometimes I almost think of a grid and how the grid could be broken up the way you would think about longitude and latitude lines on the planet. So every time I go out, I have to make sure that the piece is east-west. And then, as I'm drawing this, because I'm putting the blocks down, every 10 minutes I trace everything over. So this block is traced when it's first down, and then it's traced again in 15 minutes, then it's traced again in another 15 minutes, and then for at least 2 hours, I'm tracing everything over. Once I've done that, and what I'm doing when I'm making the models is looking at the shadow. I'm not looking at the object. I'm really not concerned about the object because, in a way, I'm stealing the shadows from the object because there's history about the shadow. The shadow in architecture has always been a spiritual force, and they used to actually crush people under the foundation stone so that their spirit would protect the building. Then they went to the period of actually taking a string and measuring the shadow of a person as they crossed the site and taking that string and buried it into the foundation. And then supposedly they've stole the spirit of the person, so the person dies. So I'm shadow stealing. And so what I do is once I do this, the blocks go away. They no longer have the character of the composition. And then I take this thing back to my studio. And in order to make it mine, I have to go through labor. And the labor is to ink it. So I ink this thing. And it takes a very long time because the lines when I draw them are rather squiggly and I'm actually making them very precise and inking it with a brush and a rapidograph. All the tools that I learned as an architect, I'm using now as an artist. So once I have this primitive, it's mine to do what I want. And so when you see these drawings, let's say we look at this drawing. This drawing is made from the primitives I made from that model. So when I was making that model, I made a primitive. You don't see that primitive here, but then once and basically it was me, actually this is the primitive. It actually was 2 pieces, I remember doing that. I had 2 pieces of paper, and as I was making this thing, I was tracing the shadows. And then I actually took a piece of mylar, went over it, and traced the whole thing over. And this is one of the few pieces, actually, that is the primitive made exactly from the shadow casting. But usually what I do is, and I had a show in Buffalo in 2007 where I showed about 10 large drawings like this. Each one was about 4 foot by 8 foot, because I showed all the full scale drawings. In other words, what I mean, I took the primitives and I manipulated them and made large drawings. When I started my sabbatical, I needed space, so I started to do small drawings. So when you go see these drawings here, these drawings are made from my primitives that are reduced on a photocopy machine. And each one of them is made up of me, because now the primitive belongs to me, the shadow is mine. It's no longer attached to the object. And so I have the freedom to manipulate it. So I'm basically tracing this on a light table and just allowing my mind to daydream as I'm constructing this drawing. But it's all made from the one primitive. Once the drawing is done, I name it. I don't really think of anything while I'm drawing it except for form and space and composition. But really I'm just playing. I'm playing with the form and seeing things happen. Here I started to feel this bit of a chain that was going on. But it started to look like junctures to me, so I ended up calling it terminal precincts. Each thing looked like a precinct, you know, and again, so they become architectural, but only in my kind of programmatic reading of it rather than trying to force it. On this one, this is another primitive that I really like because it really got a sense of lightness, and when I was drawing it, again, when I'm drawing these things, I'm daydreaming, allowing my mind to wander, and things just start to happen. And so this one was called air crafting, because it's like an aircraft, but it's really the crafting of air. But again, the thing that's most important about these drawings, the ones that aren't the primitives, is I'm doing them pencil on mylar. Now, mylar has been used by architects for many, many years, but we used to ink on mylar. Now we don't do that anymore. Now drawing's done with the computer. So all the tools and techniques from drafting I'm using now to make art. But when I use mylar, I use pencil, and pencil smears on mylar. When I was trained to draft, I was told if I was right-handed, you start on the left start of the page, and you ink so that you don't smear it. Well, I reverse that. When I do these drawings, I go from the right to the left, so as I'm drawing, it's smearing, and then I'm allowed, it creates a patina or a smear, a residue, that I then can erase, and when I erase it, I get two-dimensional layers. You can see that here, and you can see it a lot. These three primitives were made at Gallup. So I call this one the first colonist, I call this one the second colonist, and I call this one Playform 2, because Playform 1 is the thing that generated all these projects. It's a drawing I did, it's a second drawing I did as a series once I came to Lehigh. Ricardo gave me a show in 1993, and that particular primitive is one that's always been really close to me, really important to me. So I actually had a student work with me. I paid him to be my assistant, and he turned my drawings into drawings that could be used on the laser. But let's go look at these first. So here you can see the example of how that primitive was manipulated to make this drawing. There's a clear connection here because I allowed each primitive to retain its own identity. I call this the bachelors because it reminded me a little bit of Duchamp, but only in the sense that these four bachelors seem to be going after this perfectly unsmeared image on the side. But you can see the connection between this primitive and this one. This one here, I do some large ones, and I don't usually do squares, but when I do squares, they tend to force me to become symmetrical for some reason. When I do rectangles, I'm not symmetrical. But when I was doing this one, for some reason, I started to become symmetrical. And it started to make me think about mimicking a city or an urban view where you're looking up. But what you see in these drawings, there's multiple perspective lines, so sometimes you're looking up, sometimes you're looking down, sometimes you're looking sideways. Because the shadow is flat as a primitive, but when I draw it, I give it depth. So I can give the drawing depth, and when I give the drawing depth, it changes the orientation of how you're reading it as a form. This one also, I had a funny name for it because it looked like a tale of a city, and I started to think of Tale of Two Cities. Yeah. This is the only shadow model that I've kept for people to see. And I did it mostly for this show because I wanted people to see what the shadow models look like. Usually they're not as fixed as this one is. This one, I made a point of gluing it and making it stay together so that we could use it in the show and I could have the map to show along with it. But you can see it's made up of pieces left over from the laser cutter, partial models from students, pieces of things. And again, when I'm putting this together, the constructing process is somewhat open, and you might say, one of my mentors as Professor Marco Viscardi used to say, constructing and construing happen together. So as you're constructing, you're construing, and that's what you're seeing. And this one is quite nice because you see the shadow on the wall because you see the shadow on there. But again, when I'm doing this, I do them always outside because when you shadow pass it outside, the sun is much brighter and you get a very distinct shadow. Even here, we can't get a really distinct shadow. It's quite cool. This piece back here was a byproduct of the McDowell colony also, because when I went there, I had a few laser cut pieces of cardboard, and I realized when the pieces that were cut fell through, if I turned them 90 degrees, they would help support the piece. So you can see here, this one I call shadow box because it's opaque, and it's actually creating a series of shadows in the background. And especially in the gallery here, because we have multiple sources of light, you get many different shadows in the background. I'm about to do I'm an artist in residence at the Experimental Printmaking Institute in Lafayette this year, and I'm playing a lot with embossing, a lot of these laser cutted things that I'll be doing. And hopefully I'll have a show there this time next year. But this one was kind of nice for many reasons. First, I love the burnt edge of the wood from the laser cutter. And for me, architecture and art's always, when it retains the character of its making, it makes it much more exciting for me. The final piece, let's go look at these guys. These guys are some of my favorites, and again, they come from me manipulating the shadow. And this piece is actually going to be the cover of the booklet when it's done, hopefully next week. But this one was quite interesting to me because when I did it was horizontal, and in the book you'll see it horizontal. When I was at the McDowell colony, I put these all vertical, and I put some of the drawings that I did, in 2007, up vertically. And when they were vertical, they started to not look as much like little cityscapes, but more like figures. And this one really started to become figurative. When I was at the McDowell colony, I did a projection of this and did a 4.5 foot by 9 foot drawing of this on Mylar. But it was damaged when the roofs leaked at Chandler Ullman, so I couldn't display it. But the funny thing about it, the bigger I drew them, the smaller they were perceived. So when I got really large, it looked like, a body. Actually, when it was small, the length of the one over there, when it was maybe 3 foot by 6 foot, it looked like a body. When it became 4 foot by 8 foot, it actually looked like an object, almost like a vase. So it's kind of strange that the bigger the drawings became, the smaller they were perceived. But on these, you can see the layering technique of the eraser. And sometimes, obviously I've been doing composition for a long time, so it's inherent in my way of seeing. And things just start to happen. So clearly there's an arabesque that was happening here, but I did not preconceive it. On this one I did preconceive, saying I'm going to make somehow a circle, because I know people, when they look at objects, they strive to find order. And we just do it, even if we think we're the most avant-garde, chaos-oriented people, we always look for order. So on this one, I purposely started to play with this where the circle became a point. And then I showed it to an old student of mine who's now in Argentina, and he said it looked like solar flares. And I said, wow, that's kind of interesting. And so I call it solar flare constructs, because it does kind of pull around. And this one, again, I drew horizontally, but when I held it vertically, it clearly looked like a spine. And I think I call this one nodal junctions, because they all look like nodes. But again, these projects, I orient in many different ways when I'm doing them. And then once I have to give them a title, which I really don't like doing much, but actually when I'm forced to do it, it does make me see them in a different way. And I think it does help the viewer see them. What I don't like about titles is it makes you see things just one way, and the ambiguity tends to leave. The final piece is probably the one that's the most dynamic and the one that's going to lead to my next phase of work. And it was when I took that primitive, like the one that made the shadow box, and I had Mike Moore work with Ryan Slocum to actually cut them in plexiglass. So I had one layer cut in plexiglass so that the pieces came out, and one layer burnished so that the laser cutter was scarring it. And so the first model of this is somewhat small, about this big. And I made a cube, because cubes are what we do
do. And because the piece was a cube, it was easy to put together. But then I just started to see all these shadows that were projecting, but I also started to see light. You know, so because of the edge of the plexiglass and the nature of it, it creates a prism, so you not only get shadow, you get light projected. And that was a complete surprise to me, but probably the most cathartic thing, because something that started as a shadow is now projecting light. And so it was really quite interesting. My goal for this piece is eventually I'm applying for a Corning fellowship. And if I get the Corning fellowship where they make glass, I would like to make this thing where a person is about this big, so it's maybe 12 foot by 12 foot, have water come through this wall, drip down here and splash over, and then there'll be another piece down here that the water will, another piece of this that'll flow, so the water will kind of look the way it looks when water flows on the rise. But then you'll get that dynamic nature of the way light hits water and reflects and creates prisms. And what it does for me, it allows me to return to a more critical practice of architecture, so I'm actually making pieces in the public square that engage people on a different scale. But this one has been the most fun for me because it's opened up a new world. I started to go from thinking about manual craft to digital craft. I'm starting to see things as architectural form again, so it's kind of interesting that I've gone from being an architect for 20 years, teaching for 20 years, and now practicing as an artist for